What's up, Barnhill family, and welcome back to your home for all things combat sports.
Yo.
So, Nick, it did not take long for the conversations to resurface about a potential rematch of Islam Makhachev versus Arman Tsarukyan after that vicious KO that he scored against Beneil Dariush last night. And the reality of the matter is that Islam does need to have some fresh faces in there with him when you're talking about title fights. And I know they have fought before, but Arman was, I believe, 23 years old when that fight took place.
Right.
And it was a decision victory for Islam. So it's not a stretch to say that he, especially now that he's got two brutal knockouts in a row, has improved his game and sort of rounded things out to where it could be a competitive fight if he were to get in there with Islam again. And while there's a lot of guys at the top of 155 that we talk about, Gaethje, Poirier, Charles Oliveira, and Beneil was up until last night, it does seem like the UFC wants to get some fresh blood inserted in there, and that a lot of those bigger names kind of have their sights pointed at each other and also at Conor McGregor and big money fights and things of that nature. And I think it basically, given the fact that Arman took no damage last night, that if the UFC does make a Charles Oliveira versus Islam Makhachev rematch to happen in early 2024, that they should consider putting Tsarukyan in there as a backup fighter. I know Mateusz Gamrot would not be happy about that, but I feel like what he did last night against Benny would certainly warrant it.
Oh, it was so impressive. And Arman Tsarukyan is going to be a problem at 155 for a very long time. But I think Islam Makhachev is kind of overdoing these rematches. And to be completely honest, I was down for the Volkanovski one. I kind of hated that it was like on 9 or 10 days notice. But the Charles Oliveira one never really got me out of my seat.
No.
Of course, I'm going to tune in. I'm a fight fan. I don't miss a fight regardless of who's fighting. But Islam Makhachev really should be fighting the elite of the elite. And while I'm not trying to say that Charles Oliveira is not, because he most certainly is, we saw those two guys go. It wasn't competitive. And at the end of the day, Islam Makhachev's only going to be around for a few years, and we need to get him in there with as many different bodies as possible. And I know this is a rematch, but it's very much like Leon Edwards versus Kamaru Usman. So many people that saw them fight for the title and saw Leon Edwards get his hand raised didn't see their fight 8 or 9, 10 fights ago when Leon Edwards lost to Kamaru Usman. You know, most people, if you ask them, did Arman Tsarukyan and Islam Makhachev have a competitive fight? They're going to say, you know what? I didn't even know they fought because it was so long ago and Islam's done so many great things. But I will say, if you go back and watch that fight, it's one of the most competitive fights Islam Makhachev has ever had in his UFC career. Obviously, he has that one loss, but everything other than that has been pretty much dominant for Islam Makhachev. Arman looked like he gave him everything he could handle, and that was just a 23-year-old. And I know Islam Makhachev is a lot better than he was in 2019, but the same thing can be said for Arman Tsarukyan. I think Arman's a real problem. He's got the skills as far as wrestling goes, as far as taking the fight where he wants it to go, and he's got really powerful striking, as we saw last night. That sequence he hit on Beneil Dariush not only had a ton of power on it, it had a ton of creativity and was very skillful, and it took a great deal of basically high-level striking to get that thing done. Now, you watch Beneil Dariush, who's doing everything right. He's got a high guard because he knows some vicious striking was coming his way, and he still can't get out of the way of that long hook that Arman threw. And that hook didn't even land flush on the chin or right on the temple. It was kind of behind the ear and a little bit low, which is a very weird spot to hit somebody. It can certainly wobble you, but it's not really going to knock most people out. It seemed like it really stunned Beneil, and then he had that reinforced knee straight from that long hook right into a tie plum position, and then he was going for that reinforced knee, but the knee did kind of miss. But when you're watching it in live time, you couldn't quite tell that. Followed up by a switch stance hook. Beautiful sequence from Arman Tsarukyan. That showed me that not only is this guy a great wrestler, but he's a high-level striker. And like you said, there's so many guys at the top of 155, but they're moving at a snail's pace, and they're all looking for Conor McGregor. Is Nate Diaz coming back? Can I mix it up with somebody else or maybe try to steal a fight with Islam Makhachev? And at the end of the day, I think Arman Tsarukyan is the right guy. As long as he can continue going on the path that he's going, he's going to wind up in there with Islam Makhachev, and it's going to be a lot like Leon Edwards versus Kamaru Usman Part 2.
Yeah, it's certainly going to be even more competitive, and that's saying a lot because the first time it was extremely competitive. Now,
Right.
You are absolutely right. You can't just talk about one side of the coin and not the other. Right. Islam Makhachev in 2019 is not the fighter, that he is today.
For sure.
Just like Arman is not the fighter that he was in 2019 today. The question is going to be who's made the biggest gaps in improvement, and typically somebody who's in their early 20s is not even smelling their prime yet.
Right.
And Islam is, I think, 31, almost 32 years years old. So he was kind of in that mid to late 20s era when they fought the first time. So I think just by the nature of their age and how you develop into your frame and what you learn as a fighter in your early 20s carrying into your late 20s, it's not a stretch to say that Arman could have potentially improved in more ways than Islam has.
Yeah.
And I know that's a crazy thing to say because Islam Makhachev is the number one pound for pound fighter in the sport right now by a lot of people's account.
And is progressing at a crazy rate.
And yeah, exactly. He's winning against Alexander Volkanovski, one of the most prolific strikers in the game, not with great grappling, but with head kicks.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it just shows you how well he's improving as well. And I think Tsarukyan versus Makhachev too would be just about the highest level of mixed martial arts competition that you could reasonably squeeze into a cage. And Dana White at the press conference last night said he's all about that rematch. He said that's a fun fight. That's probably an Abu Dhabi next year sort of fight, which does kind of indicate that Arman will have to fight at least one more time before then. And we spoke about it just a few minutes ago, Jalen Turner.
Yeah.
He's somebody who's on a streak as well. He's doing some things prolifically with his striking that are really starting to get people to notice him, and people are starting to use his name in the conversation for who could be potentially fighting for a title in 2024 and beyond. So I think the natural progression is to pair those two guys up, but I also wouldn't be mad if the UFC did make the Oliveira-Makhachev fight, but did it with the caveat that Tsarukyan was the backup fighter. And as I said, I know that Mateusz Gamrot would be unsatisfied with that. But at the end of the day, what Arman did last night puts him ahead of Gamrot as far as a backup fighter is concerned, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's very much a sport of what have you done for me lately. And Arman Tsarukyan is the hottest thing at 155 as it sits today. Of course, he's going to cool down and some things are going to pan out over the next couple months, and we're going to see some other things shake out. But Arman Tsarukyan has just inserted himself into the top 5 of the 155 division. He has some previous, stuff going on with the champion. Everybody thinks that was a competitive fight that saw it, and they'd love to see him back in there again. Obviously, he's 27 years old, so he doesn't have to jump the gun. But if these older guys at the top of 155 are going to move at that slow rate, and like you said, look for Conor McGregor, look for Nate Diaz, try to get themselves these bigger matchups that are seemingly bigger than the title in a lot of ways, then we could see Arman Tsarukyan, a 27-year-old, maybe 28 at the time, getting himself a title shot against Islam Makhachev, and that could set up for some really interesting things. And I will agree with you that Arman's probably covered a lot of ground as far as progressing as a fighter, but I have to say Islam Makhachev is getting better and better at a ridiculous rate, and I don't know how he's doing it. You know, you saw him against Volkanovski in the first fight, and it was very competitive, but that made us realize, okay, Volkanovski is one of the baddest dudes on the planet. And then for him to come back, and I know it was on 9 or 10 days' notice, but still, you're dealing with Volkanovski, a guy who, if he's not number 1 pound for pound in the world, he's number 2. And you didn't let him get one significant strike scored on you. That is insane to me. And I think Islam Makhachev going out there and submitting Charles Oliveira, not getting touched one time by a Volkanovski, that's showing us that he's progressing at a level that I don't think the sport of MMA has ever seen before, and I don't really know when we're going to see it again. So I love that Islam Makhachev just cracked into his prime years, and I think he's going to be a real tough cookie to deal with for the next several years, including for people like Arman Tsarukyan.
Yeah, I agree.